Find the derivative of y equals 3x plus 1 to the 4/3 times 2x minus 1 to the 5/4. So y here is the product of two functions. We have the 3x plus 1 raised to the fractional exponent of 4/3, and we have the 2x minus 1 raised to the fractional exponent of 5/4. Since we have a product of functions, our derivative will involve the product rule. So the derivative y prime, which can also be called dy dx, will equal to the derivative of the first. Now the first will follow a power rule. We'll bring down the power, 4/3, leave the inside alone, 3x plus 1. Subtract 1 from the power, I will call that 3/3, and then multiply by the derivative of the inside to complete the chain rule. The derivative of the inside will be a 3. Derivative of the first times the second left alone plus the first left alone times the derivative of the second. Well, the second will also be a power rule. We'll bring the power down. We'll leave the inside alone. We'll subtract 1 from the power. I will call that 4/4. And multiply by the derivative of the inside to complete the chain rule for that. And that'll be a 2. Okay, in our next step, y prime, or dy dx, I'm going to collect together the constants. Everything here is multiplying each other, so this 4/3 and this 3 can be put together. 3 times 4 is 12, so we will have 12/3 times 3x plus 1 to the 4 minus 3, which is 1/3, times the 2x minus 1 to the 5/4. The second term, I'm going to put the constants together. I have the 5/4 here, and I have the 2 here. 2 times 5 is 10, so plus 10/4. And I have a 3x plus 1 to the 4/3 and a 2x minus 1 to the 5 minus 4, which is 1/4. In the next step, we can reduce the constants. 12 divided by 3 is a 4. I will leave everything else the way it is. And then 10 divided by 4, we can reduce that by a factor of 2. And that will take us down to a 5/2. That's the lowest we can take that. And then everything else will remain the same. Okay, so our next step here, we're going to want to start to factor this. Now 4 and 5/2 don't have a common factor right now, but they can be made to have a common factor if we give them a common denominator. Right now that 4 is not over a 2, it's just a 4 over a 1, but we can multiply it by 2/2 or call it 8/2, and then we can factor a 1/2 out. That is something we're going to want to do. That will help simplify this. So our next step is to actually restate that 4 as an 8/2. And then I'll leave everything else. So 3x plus 1 to the 1/3, 2x minus 1 to the 5/4. I have a 5/2, a 3x plus 1 to the 4/3, and a 2x minus 1 to the 1/4. Now we can start factoring. The first thing we can factor out is a 1/2. Now if we factor out a 1/2, that'll just leave an 8. Everything else will remain as is. And that will leave just a 5. We're factoring a 1/2 out of the entire expression. And that's why we had put them over a common denominator, so we can factor that 1/2. In our next step, we're going to start factoring expressions to powers. So we have a 1/2 already factored out. The next thing I'm going to factor out is a 3x plus 1 to a power. Now if we look, we have a 3x plus 1 to a 1/3, and we have a 3x plus 1 to a 4/3. We can factor out the lower of the two, that's the 1/3. So 3x plus 1 to the 1/3 power. Now when we factor out, we're dividing, and dividing means subtracting exponents. So we're subtracting this exponent that we're factoring out. It's a 1/3 we're factoring out, a 1/3 power. We're going to subtract the 1/3 from the equivalent terms of 3x plus 1. So in here, we're going to be subtracting a 1/3 from this. That'll give us to the 0, and anything to the 0 is a 1. So all that will be removed and become a 1. And then from this one here, we're going to be subtracting a 1/3 from its exponent. Well, if you subtract a 1/3 from 4/3, you're going to end up with 3/3, or a power of 1. And that's what we'll have left over. We'll be left over with a power of 1, so it's going to remove that and make it be a power of 1. So there's overall what we should have left. And 8 times a 2x minus 1 raised to the 5/4 plus a 5 times a 3x plus 1 to a 4/3 minus 1/3. 3/3 are just 1 power. And then we have a 2x minus 1 to a 1/4. In our next step, we're going to now factor out the 2x minus 1 to a power. So I already have a 1/2. I have a 3x plus 1 to the 1/3. We're now going to factor out a 2x minus 1. Now looking in here, we have a 5/4 and a 1/4. We can factor out the lower power of the two, and that'll be the 1/4 power. So I can factor out a 2x minus 1 to the 1/4 power. Now when I factor that out, that's again dividing and subtracting a 1/4. So this first term, we're going to be subtracting a 1/4 here, and 5/4 minus 1/4 is 4/4. And that will become a power of 1. And then here, if we subtract a 1/4 from this 1/4, that'll be to the power of 0. And power of 0 gives you a 1. That whole term will be removed. So what's going to happen altogether is that's going to be fully removed. And this one's going to subtract to be a value of 1. And there's what we should have left over. So we will have 8 times a 2x minus 1 to the 5/4 minus 1/4, 4/4, which is a 1, plus 5 times 3x plus 1, and then we've fully removed the 2x minus 1 to the 1/4 power. All right, so now our derivative, y prime, which is equal to dy dx, is a 1/2, a 3x plus 1 to the 1/3, a 2x minus 1 to the 1/4, and then inside the square brackets I'm going to now distribute the 8 into here. That will be 16x minus 8, and I'm going to distribute the 5 into here, and that will be 15x plus 5. And now we can combine like terms together. So we have a 1/2, a 3x plus 1 to the 1/3, a 2x minus 1 to the 1/4, and then adding 16x plus 15x, that'll be a 31x. And then a minus 8 and a positive 5 will be a negative 3. So there it is simplified. That's one way to keep the answer. The 1/3 and the 1/4 powers may be able to be rewritten with radicals and as roots. So let's write that version down as well. And quite often that 31x minus 3 may be put in the front with the 1/2. So there's various ways this answer might be written. But one option is the 1/2 times the 31x minus 3 first, and then the 3x plus 1 to the 1/3, and then the 2x minus 1 to the 1/4. So there's one way to order everything in there. And another option is to write those powers as roots. So here's another option for it. Y prime or dy dx can also be written as 1/2 31x minus 3. And then the 1/3 power means first power, a cubed root. So we can write this as the cubed root of 3x plus 1. And then 1/4 power means to the first power and then fourth root. So fourth root of 2x minus 1. So that's an optional way to write that. And then, of course, having the entire thing over a 2 is another way to write it. We have a 1/2 multiplying everything, so we can just put everything over 2 is yet another way to state this answer. But there's the result for the derivative, y prime or dy dx.